Hi everyone, we'll get started now if that's okay, if everyone's had a chance for a coffee and tea for pastries. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Women's Mental Health Network to today's event, and thank you very much for joining us. My name's Louise O'Leary. I work as Advocacy Manager in St Patrick's Mental Health Services, and along with my colleague Elena Donnelly, who's Head of Social Work in St Patrick's, and Darren Crossan, who's Women's Health Policy Lead in the National Women's Council, and Pushali Kundu, the Women's Health Officer in the National Women's Council. We jointly coordinate it, and I'm sure you'll get a chance to speak to Darren and Pushali today. Unfortunately, Elaine wasn't able to join us. Today's event is being held in collaboration with the Feminist Communities for Climate Justice and with Community Work Ireland. And I'd like to thank them for their support and input to the event. And we'd also like to thank IREC for this lovely room, for loaning it to us for the day, and to all today's contributors for giving their time and expertise today, and for coming from far-flung destinations like Cork. So thank you very much for being here. And a special thank you to our Irish Sign Language interpreters for the event, Sarah Garvey and Christina Cregan. So we founded the network as a space for shared learning and connection for anyone with a committed interest in women's mental health, and with the aim of advancing collaboration and responses related to women's mental health needs. And we try to focus on, with events like this, on topics that maybe aren't getting sufficient attention or that could benefit from more awareness, understanding or responsiveness. And we believe that's very much true of today's topic. Because while we know the vast majority of us are very rationally concerned about climate change and want to see more being done to lessen its avoidable harms, we're not talking about it enough, nor what it means for our health and lives, nor what it means for children's health and lives, and for that of future generations. So we hope today will offer an open and supportive space for us to have some conversation, to share knowledge and perspectives, and to hopefully inspire some impactful actions. If you're on social media about the event, we invite you to use the hashtags Women's Mental Health or Feminist Climate Justice. A few just housekeeping points for you. There are 3 fire exits in the room, 1 at the back of the room and 2 at the side where you came in. And if the fire alarm goes, you exit through the door in the reception area where you entered. And the fire assembly point is across the street from the IREC building outside of the court building. The toilets, which some of you may have already found, are out past the main reception and then down the corridor to the right. And there's a disabled access toilet beside the main reception desk. There's also a changing place available if needed. I don't see any buggies in the room, so I think we're okay. We have had babies in arms at previous events, so not today. So we have a great lineup of contributors ahead for this morning. To get us started, I'm just going to give a very brief introductory presentation to help set the scene on climate change and mental health overall, and the growing knowledge and research emerging. Okay. Oh, sorry, I pressed the wrong thing. I didn't even look at the screens. That's not very, good. Hello. Thank you so much. Thanks, Michelle. So we think it's important, first of all, to recognise and name that what is happening in our world at present is not normal. Climate change and its health impacts are not normal. The inadequate responses we're seeing to the climate emergency and the harm it's causing are not rational. But your response to these things likely is both normal and rational. It's normal and rational to feel anxiety, distress, or overwhelm when we're facing the magnitude and gravity of climate change. And at events like this, where we're focusing and talking and contemplating climate crisis, it can understandably elicit strong responses within us, which may be uncomfortable or distressing. So we just wanted to sort of acknowledge that. And as with all of our events, we wanted to remind everyone to check in with ourselves over the day, take a deep breath, stretch, move about, take breaks as and when you need to. And for the last half an hour, we are going to shift gears, and there'll be opportunity for chats via a climate cafe we'll be facilitating, as well as a sensory nature-based activity guided by Dr. Sinead O'Connor of Festina Lente, and we'll be sharing support information at that point too. I'm sure everyone's eyes have been drawn to this beautiful creation over there, so we'll get to explore that later. I'm finding that calming already. I don't know about anybody else just looking at it. So we're going to be learning about the varied ways that climate change multiplies health threats, and in particular for women. But what is essential for us to remember is that climate action is a health and justice amplifier, and that's something that we have to focus on more, we have to promote for, and really something that we should be celebrating. Real transformative climate action can unlock huge mental health benefits for society. So while it's vital we're aware and informed about the risks and realities ahead, we also need to recognise the possibilities for positive change and be able to imagine the world we want to live in and we want our children to inherit, one that supports and protects nature and health for all. So I know our speakers are going to share lots of insights into mental health impacts, particularly for women, and links with health inequalities. But just to get us thinking and to help join the dots a bit, these images illustrate just a few examples of climate change impacts that we may see in the media, and which can have varied and serious consequences for mental health, but are rarely considered in that context, nor as to how they are interlinked with inequalities. The dots are rarely joined. For example, we know that extreme weather events like the floods we're going to see more of in Ireland, and that image in the top left is from floods in Ireland, floods in Limerick a few years ago. Floods increase the risk of a range of mental health difficulties amongst those affected. So too can climate hazards like the unprecedented heat we're reading about, breaking records month on month around the world. So too can forced migration, the burden being heaped onto children and future generations, and then broader climate anxiety and distress that many of us can feel. These examples are only a handful of the ways in which climate change and mental health interlink. So I just wanted to draw your attention to this. I know it's kind of busy as a slide, but I wanted to make you aware of it. It's quite a helpful model, I think, from the World Health Organization, which maps out the different ways that climate change hazards and environmental threats can interact with vulnerability factors and inequalities, and can also compound them, including gender and sex, and lead to a range of possible mental health psychosocial outcomes. One of the things we will be doing is sharing a range of resources and information for anybody who wants to learn more about climate change and mental health. So the policy briefs this comes from will be linked on that afterwards. So don't worry about good luck trying to get that all down on paper, but we will be sharing it. And you'll see in the far left the column there that lists some of the possible mental health and psychosocial outcomes, including emerging concepts like ecological grief and climate anxiety or eco-anxiety. There's increasing and compelling research on the varied impacts of climate change on mental health, including concepts like eco-anxiety or climate anxiety. This infographic is by a science communicator called Kat Lau, based on a very recent report by Burson Ickes and Joshua Carlson of the Neuroclimate Working Group. That's another group that might be of interest to people working in that field, and is also linked on the information that we'll be providing. Their 2025 report looked at what's happening at a neurological level, what's happening in our brains when we're experiencing eco-anxiety and what might help on that basis. So they looked at it from that perspective. And they found, unsurprisingly, that eco-anxiety is correlated with activity in areas of the brain crucial for responding to environmental threats. I'm not going to read out the areas of the brain in case I mispronounce them, and I think this is being recorded, so I'm not going to do that. But I think it's quite an interesting study to show the growing attention and really strong evidence that's coming for these things that we're experiencing. And they also found that eco-anxiety can be really alleviated by different approaches based on the evidence they found, including collective climate action. So not individual collective climate action like the changes we might be making in lifestyle, but collective climate action. And it's really important, because I know we're going to be talking about climate anxiety, I think that's going to come up as a theme, but it's really important that we acknowledge it's not a pathological condition or an illness. It's a normal response to abnormal events that are happening in the world. However, it doesn't mean that we may not benefit sometimes from additional mental health support to deal with it, especially if it's impacting our well-being or daily life, like any issue we're experiencing in our mental health. So this type of research is really important to help us learn and understand what's effective. And that paper adds to the evidence around effective responses to eco-anxiety and evidence that it can lead to pro-environmental behaviour and effective climate action. I really like this quote from a book I bought a few years ago on a personal level, just to learn about climate anxiety and deal with some of the feelings I was experiencing. And it's accepting the realities of the climate crisis goes hand in hand with accepting the strong emotions it generates. How we learn to manage these emotions and evoke them to strengthen our well-being can also positively impact the planet. So climate action at an individual level and at a collective level can support and amplify mental health. Excuse me. But vitally, at the level we need to see change at, systemic and economy-wide climate action, that will garner huge mental health benefits for the public and society overall, alongside physical health. And this includes clean air policies, ensuring safe and sustainable travel options, the importance of access to nature for all, including in urban areas, and the importance of community work and community action being supported. Something we're keen to explore at this event, I know there's a mix of different backgrounds in the room, is the impactful role health workers can have as climate advocates. And I know Marica and Amy are going to speak more to that, because as we will be exploring and emphasising, the climate crisis is a health crisis also, but climate solutions are also health solutions. And if we are going to progress human rights-based approaches to mental health, then they must necessarily integrate climate change within them, because climate change is a human rights issue and is an equality issue. And I don't know if people saw the recently launched WHO guidance on mental health policy and strategic action plans. It's really good. I recommend checking it out. They are very clear at addressing this and comprehensively giving guidance about how mental health services can do that. So to close on a positive note and to pass on to our next speaker, I just wanted to share this quote from Greta Thunberg, which I heard on a podcast the other week, to inspire us all to act where we can, including within our workplaces and communities, because once we start to act, hope is everywhere. So hopefully we'll have a hopeful day today. So we're now going to move on to hear from We're now going to move on to hear from Vanessa Conroy. Where's Vanessa? Oh, there you are. Who is the project officer of Feminist Communities for Climate Justice, a joint project between the National Women's Council and Community Work Ireland, aiming to push a gendered, feminist and community work lens on climate justice. Previously, Vanessa worked as an occasional lecturer and academic tutor in Maynooth University's Department of Applied Social Studies, teaching on environmental policy, climate justice, intersectional environmentalism, and the connection between gender and the climate crisis. And Vanessa excitedly is going to launch today the findings of the health chapter of the Feminist Communities for Climate Justice Baseline Research Report. So we're delighted to have that launched today, and I welcome Vanessa.
Thanks very much for the lovely introduction, and thank you everybody for coming here today, and also thank you to St. Pat's and to the Women's Mental Health Network for coming together with us for this event, which I think is very exciting and unique. My name is Vanessa Conroy, and as I was said, I'm the project officer on the Feminist Communities for Climate Justice project, which is a joint project between the National Women's Council of Ireland and Community Work Ireland. And this is kind of just a sketch of kind of our project partners. We also did work with Maynooth University's Department of Applied Social Studies, and we are funded currently by the Government Department of Environment, Climate and Communications. So I'm going to briefly talk a little bit about the project, why it exists and the work we do, and then I will speak to the findings of the health chapter of our baseline research report and focusing largely on the mental health findings and that. So our Feminist Communities for Climate Justice project has 4 kind of pillars of activity. What we want to do is amplify the voices of communities and women who are most impacted by the climate crisis. As was said, climate change is like, you know, kind of a multiplier of threats and of inequalities, and that includes inequalities here in Ireland as well, along the lines of gender, disability, race, and so on and so forth. And we also want to advocate and influence policies with those communities as well, not like, you know, on their behalf. We want to do it in partnership with them. We also are hoping to mobilize communities to support and learn from one another. We have a network within our project, which is now up to 140 members, and that is community groups, individuals, academics, activists, anyone and everyone who has an interest in social justice or climate change and wants to kind of learn from each other and how to tackle it collectively. And we are also working to strengthen the capacity and raise the consciousness, particularly for community development workers and community workers on the ground, working with quite marginalised or disadvantaged communities. And so we're doing that with the development of 2 toolkits, which we hope to have out next month. And we also, with Maynooth University, ran a 20-week training certificate programme for community workers and activists and climate workers in community work and feminist approaches to climate justice work. So why this project? There's kind of 4 key reasons, and like, you know, showing the strengths of our project partners. Specifically, we are a project to respond to the needs of community workers on the ground who recognise that climate change will have a disproportionate impact on the communities that they're working with, but communicating that is really difficult, they've found. And so what we want to do is give them the tools to make climate change a more immediate problem for these communities, how it impacts their health, like we're talking about today, housing, transport, how they care for one another. And so that's how we are currently developing the content for those workers. We're also responding to quite big data and policy gaps in Ireland. Our existing climate policy doesn't adequately pay enough attention to the domestic gendered impacts of the climate crisis. And so that's work that we hope to do. We also wanted to create a feminist analysis of climate justice in Ireland, and also a direct response to the membership of the National Women's Council who wanted climate justice and attention to climate integrated into the Council's ongoing work. Within our Feminist Climate Justice report, we actually talk about dimensions of climate injustice rather than climate justice. And really what we want to say about climate justice as a concept, again, is that climate change doesn't equally impact everybody. And so when we're talking about these dimensions of climate injustice, what we want to put across is that people who are already disadvantaged or marginalized or socially excluded in the face of climate change have contributed the least to the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that are currently causing climate change, but will be more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. They also tend to be burdened by current climate policy to tackle climate change and are least likely to see the benefits of those climate policies. So when we're talking about things like tax breaks or like, you know, reductions in price for like being an early adopter of something like buying an electric vehicle or retrofitting your home, it's the people who have the disposable income already at hand who will see those tax breaks and benefits, and not the people on the ground who maybe are more in need of seeing those kind of reduced prices. And also, very importantly, they are less likely to have their voices heard in decision-making spaces around climate or in decisions that impact their lives. And they're also less likely to actually be decision makers in those spaces themselves. But why women is something we might ask, and particularly maybe in a country like Ireland, where we might not think gender inequality is so severe as it is in other countries. But as was said, climate change is basically a threat multiplier, and basically existing gender inequalities are basically piled on top of by the impacts of climate change. And that includes here in Ireland, where we still have a gender pension gap and a pretty severe gender pay gap and pension gap, which has implications particularly for older women when we're talking about the impacts of climate change as well. And there's also a very interesting connection that I don't think I'll have time to elaborate on too much about women doing twice as much unpaid care work compared to men in Ireland still, and how that has an impact on how they experience climate change, particularly because how we care for one another changes how we procure and use food, energy in particular, where it's most immediately billable in our homes, how we get about on transport, whether we decide to use public transport or use a car, and also choices about our security. And just a few more kind of pieces here to really kind of underline this is that sadly the majority of deaths related to extreme weather events right now around the world are women at quite a high rate compared to men as well. And we also, again, as a kind of threat multiplier in the face of climate change, women and girls face increased vulnerabilities to all forms of gender-based violence, including conflict-related sexual violence, trafficking, child marriage, and other forms of violence. And again, when we talk about the gender pay gap, the world's poorest people are disproportionately women, which leaves you with less of a safeguard if there is a flood and you do lose your home, or if you do lose your business. And then again, the current policies that we're seeing, not just in Ireland, but pretty much all over the world, don't pay adequate enough attention to gender and despite the fact that women are half of the world's population. And if it doesn't work for women, it doesn't work for half of the world's population. And so we really need to see decision makers pay more attention to gender in climate policy writing, and also seeing the fact that we are living in a world of climate change now, and that climate policy can't be a siloed area from housing policy, from transport policy, from health policy. They all need to be in conversation with one another. And so just some facts around mental health and climate change before we come to the findings of our own research is that the most recent 2024 Lancet study looking at climate change and health in Europe found that extreme weather events can trigger PTSD, major depressive disorders, anxiety, depression, grief, and recovery fatigue. And particularly in certain communities where you'll see flooding or extreme weather hit over and over again, it's about rebuilding from scratch and noticing that these weather events are becoming more and more frequent, and thinking about insurance rates going up, thinking about, will I have to replace my home or my belongings or fix up my business again and again, and the fatigue that comes with that. And we see that women and girls, older people, at-risk health groups, children and youth, low-income households, outdoor workers, marginalized communities, frontline workers, and migrants were identified as the most at risk. So again, it's those groups that are suffering, like, that are oppressed in some way, who don't have as much access to to money, to job, again, to decision-making positions as well. And then young people in particular, we hear about, are very concerned by climate change, thinking about the world that they will have to inherit. And this drives increased levels of anxiety and depression. And studies by UNESCO have found high rates of anxiety, stress, and alarm over climate change, and a sense of fear, sadness, and hopelessness even for their future. So this is our Feminist Climate Justice Report. And as was said, it's a baseline review of current climate and climate adjacent policy in Ireland. And we covered 6 pillars here. But obviously for today, we're going to focus on the chapter of health, and specifically again on the mental health impacts that we found. So what we found really in terms of just the overall areas of climate change and mental health is that poor health outcomes, including physical and mental health, have been linked to changes in climate, such as more frequent and increased and intense storms, flooding, severe droughts, and also poor air quality as well. And really strikingly, there's still huge gaps in Irish policy that fall short of addressing the public health concerns of climate change. Particularly, our current mental health policy, Sharing the Vision, does not mention climate change and its associated health-related impacts and outcomes. And when we do see certain policy documents and frameworks address the interrelation between climate change and health, the health concerns of women and marginalized communities in particular are scarcely mentioned, if they are indeed mentioned at all. And for example, the Health Climate Change Sectoral Adaptation Plan 2029 highlights that there are negative physical and mental health impacts of flooding, and states that the most vulnerable to flooding include older people, pregnant people, children, disabled people, farmers, and tourists. And you hear over and over again in the media this kind of, it's farmers versus climate action. But really, at the end of the day, we do know that climate change will have the highest impact perhaps on the livelihoods of farmers and people living in agricultural communities. So they know all about it, to be honest. But also women and marginalised communities face existing social inequalities, and these social inequalities place them at greater risks of the effects of extreme weather events, which, if you already know that you're existing at a disadvantage, this can heighten things like climate-related distress or eco-anxiety, generating, again, an array of feelings like anger, fear, powerlessness, and helplessness. And again, these are all rational reactions to have in the face of like what the world is coming to, and the kind of rate of inaction, as was said, that we're seeing from our decision makers as well. And also the term solastalgia is another term that's come up now, coined by the researcher Albrecht, which really describes feelings of homelessness in the face of climate change, as in living somewhere but seeing it kind of change around you in a way that you know you're not going to be able to get it back. And again, that kind of lack of solace and a lack of hope in the face of climate change. And one area that is definitely not explored in detail enough in our current discussions and in current policies around climate change and mental health is the impacts and the connection between eco-anxiety and reproductive health, in that climate-related distress can extend the impact of climate change on sexual and reproductive health choices, including whether you want to have children or not, kind of the anxiety of, if I have children in this world, what kind of world are they growing up into? What kind of world are my grandchildren growing up into? And reproductive anxieties can arise from concern of negative health outcomes resulting from the impact of climate change. And this is during and after pregnancy. And there are certain issues like living in an area with very bad air pollution, where it's not nearly as easy to kind of get up and move out of harm's way if you are pregnant as well. It's not like secondhand smoke where you can walk away from someone smoking beside you. If you live in an area with poor air quality, and considering as well our ongoing housing crisis on top of that, it's not nearly as easy to get out of harm's way. And eco-anxiety plays a role in shaping reproductive futures, such as concerns with the future lending themselves to reproductive anxieties, particularly about whether having children in a climate-altered future is a viable option at all for emotional, moral, and ethical reasons. So thinking about the morals even of bringing children into a world where we're seeing environmental breakdown. This can result in people experiencing a pre-loss of parenthood, which is associated with grief, distress, isolation, and guilt, and which are all noted to be symptoms of someone experiencing eco-anxiety or solastalgia as well, two concepts which we've already introduced. So that is actually it from me, but I know it was a bit of it's not exactly like, I don't have an uplifting piece at the end because this is literally what our research found, but I think the rest of our contributors and indeed our panel discussion will kind of help us flesh out some of these findings as well. And also after our comfort break, we will be hosting a climate cafe where you can talk about the feelings that arose out of this, and also more importantly, the kind of actions we can start taking now in order to start, like, you know, because again, taking action, taking collective action in particular, helps us kind of create a sense of hope and positivity, even in the face of something as big as climate change. So with that, I'll actually introduce our next contributors, and I'm very excited in particular to hear this as well. And giving us a joint presentation, we have Dr. Marica Cassarino and Dr. Amy Brogan, who are representing the Psychological Society of Ireland's Special Interest Group in addressing climate and the environmental emergency. Amy is a senior clinical psychologist and works in the Children's Disability Network Service in the HSE, as well as an honorary tutor in Trinity College Dublin. And Marica is an environmental psychologist who lectures in University College of Cork. So thank you very much, and I'll invite them to join us.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for having us. We are delighted to be here, and today we'll just talk a little bit about our group and touch on a few things that have already been touched upon, so we won't keep you too long. The name is Marica, by the way. Nobody gets it. One day I will find someone who can pronounce it. No, not directed to you. So Special Interest Group for Addressing the Climate and Environmental Emergency. This is a group that formed within the Psychological Society of Ireland that brings together all psychologists in the Republic of Ireland, and we have different divisions and groups. This group was founded by two people in particular, Dr. Owen Galvin and Dr. Ornan McCarthy, who really felt there was a gap in how, as psychologists, we talk, we address, we think about the climate and environmental emergency. So our group is really trying to elevate the role of psychological science and the contribution the psychological science and practice can bring in promoting climate action and climate-related well-being. And we have different things we do, which Amy is going to describe.
So you might wonder, I mean, I have friends that say, like, psychology, like, is that relevant to the climate crisis? And you might wonder, like, why is it? Do you not just work with the HSE? And I do mainly. But actually, psychology is kind of, I suppose, at the heart of all psychological science is well-being. And as what has been mentioned today, is what underpins all possible well-being is a healthy planet and a healthy environment, which healthy minds sit on top of. So some of the areas where psychology plays a role is, we have actually a position paper which we can link later on, but to give you kind of a whistle-stop tour today is the psychology involved in the creation of the climate crisis. So we can take this fully individualistic because it's embedded in a social and political context, but things like our relationship with the environment. So we've moved very much to a resource-based relationship with the environment. We use things we consume instead of a stewarding relationship is one example of that. So we talk about their world, their climate crisis, the oceans, not our world, our climate crisis, our environment. So thinking about our language is just one example of that. There's lots of psychology in why we're not talking about this, why we're not getting engaged, staying engaged, engaging in mitigation. So those can be kind of emotional barriers. So maybe feelings of paralysis around it, hopelessness, shame and guilt. We are all complicit. And that's kind of a difficult thing to really, really hold and deep into. We're complicit because we live in a world where it is complicit. But it can also be more psychological in nature. So things like cognitive dissonance. So how do you hold two conflicting ideas in mind? I really care about the environment and I drive a diesel car, being an example of that. Or, you know, we're not that great at thinking of things that are far away, so we can create a kind of distancing effect, is another example. Or the bystander effect. There are lots of different kind of cognitive processes that also kind of feed into why it's difficult to engage in climate action. Then when we think about behavioural and social change, so psychology can play a really important role in how do we create momentum towards social change and social change movements. How do we make people feel confident, or efficacy is a word we use a lot in psychology, about being able to engage in climate action? What do we need from our leaders? What are the characteristics or the modelling or the incentives that we need from leaders to create pro-environmental change? And psychology plays a lot in there. And how do we create hope? How do we stay engaged in such a difficult, emotive, meta problem, as climate is known as? So psychology can help us with that. And then lastly, and it's been touched on a lot, psychology plays a role in the impacts of climate change. And I suppose we're going to speak a little bit about you as health professionals will experience some of that in terms of people being directly impacted, maybe by extreme weather events or through a migration role with climate refugees in Ireland. You're going to come across this in healthcare settings, or indirectly, like things that have been mentioned, like eco-anxiety, eco-grief. I suppose that tapping into what it's like to become more climate aware. I mean, ignorance literally is bliss, and experience maybe the stress that comes with that.
Yeah, so in trying to look at all these different bits and pieces, our hope of the group is to do different things. So to educate, but firstly educate ourselves as a group and as individuals. We're trying to make a positive contribution. How we can advocate as psychologists, what in practice or in research, but also how we promote then a sustainability agenda. And we are a small group, but the beauty of our group is that it's so diverse. Even looking at Amy and myself, we both define ourselves as psychologists, but our background is very different. So maybe a bit from Emmy about your own.
Yeah, we thought we'd talk a little bit about, like, I mean, you could do a whole separate presentation on our journey to the group, but we're going to talk a little bit about what we do in the group. So we're a small group. So I became involved in the group in 2023. Prior to that, my psychology hat, so I've worked in primary care, CAMHS, disability, so across all children's services in the HSE, very familiar words, I'm sure, to people here. But my psychology hat and my climate hat were totally separate. Climate was like my mom worry, became a parent and started to read and interpret the science and became very concerned. So that concern went into like keep cups, cloth nappies, getting on my bike a lot, changing my washing powder, changing my diet, going to community things. And then it was only when I joined the SIG that those worlds kind of aligned. And we're going to speak a little bit about that because that's really relevant for you guys today, thinking about your professional voice and merging that with a climate voice. And since being in the SIG, I mean, so the first picture is me at a conference speaking about climate justice and climate anxiety. I mean, no one was more surprised than me to be speaking about that at the psychology conference in October 2023. The second picture is, I mean, it's been really enhancing, and just to say that it's not always negative. I was involved in an RTE Radio Junior Sustainable Village podcast, and we did a climate convention with loads of kids down in Cairde. So they were doing this massive project across 7 schools, and I got to speak to them about climate anxiety. And the next picture is the Green Schools programme. So I was involved in delivering a workshop to the staff on resilience. So how do you, as a staff member, work in this area over time and stay well? It is a very emotionally laden topic, and they're also working in big institutions where change is slow. So there's many layers to that. And then the last one is we've been trying to do a little bit more media work, which is my anxiety rub. Start sweating just saying it. But we wrote a press release for World Earth Day, and we're trying to do a little bit more of that because part of our goals is to become more public facing in terms of increasing the public's awareness of the psychology of climate change and just getting that conversation going.
And it's a beautiful piece. You wrote it amazingly, so you should read it. So from my end, I come from a different path. So I'm an academic and I consider myself an environmental psychologist. So I would have approached the topic of climate psychology, environmental psychology, from a very research-focused academic point of view, because that's my own contribution to the world and to society. So involved in different projects, going from understanding climate emotions to a lot of work on attitudes related to air quality and air pollution and environmental risk, through which I met the beautiful Louise. So I've been very lucky. But in doing this work, I felt very lonely. Environmental psychology as a discipline is very much in its infancy in Ireland, and I couldn't really find people I could share my experience with, I could learn from, and I could try and develop my own work agenda in a way that really fitted the needs that there are in Ireland. So in coming to the SIG, I found my tribe, in a sense, even though it's not just researchers. But it's really a group where you get stimulated at every single meeting. You get angry, you get passionate, you get hopeful, and there are so many ideas bouncing off. And if we only had 48 hours in each day, we will get much more done. And like the two of us, there are other people who will come to our SIG for many different reasons, but none of those is that we feel we're climate heroes. We actually feel we're not doing enough. And we're very dubious about our own skills and our own contribution. And then when we come together, we actually realize that what we're doing is already great, and we need to build on that to do even better things. So that's probably a reason for us to be here, to learn more, to build connections, and see what other directions we can take. And so in the focusing on, let's say, the psychological dimensions of the climate crisis, as a group, we are interested in both the direct and indirect effects that the climate crisis can have on mental health and well-being, and within the scope of this meeting, particularly women's mental health and well-being. And we're not going to go through the details because I think we have already gone, both Louise and Vanessa have gone through the different impacts. For one thing I would say about the direct impacts, which obviously floods are very relevant to Ireland, but let's not underestimate heat. We have had, at least down in Cork, where I'm based, 2 beautiful weeks, but we shouldn't have had those two beautiful sunny weeks at this time of the year. So let's not underestimate the impact that that can have on our physical health and mental health. And Vanessa mentioned air quality. I do my research on perceptions, but also the impacts on air quality. And as women, we know, Vanessa said that, we're more impacted by environmental risks, but we also have the double threat of seeing our children impacted by environmental risks. We know their children are more impacted by air pollution because their lungs are developing, and because they are at lower heights, so they are impacted by things like car idling, and those pollutants pass our bloodstream and get into our brain, get into our children's brain. And so we are impacted as women, both directly and also through the health of our children. And these are becoming more and more relevant and important to the work of healthcare professionals, including healthcare professionals who work in psychology. Those and the indirect impacts that have been mentioned, but I'll pass it over to.
Yeah, we'll keep it brief because I know we're
over
time. We're over out. Yeah, so I suppose, you know, continuing from what you were saying, as parents, there's a picture there about Mothers for Climate Change. You know, some of the literature has coined the term moral injury. So moral injury to children because they're being failed but systemically by their governments and leaders, but a moral injury to their parents because climate change is interfering with their basic duties of parents to provide care and protection. So there's kind of a burgeoning literature around that. And I've flagged Parents for Future group here, which Louise is also involved with. But it's an advocacy group for caregivers of children in Ireland. Yeah, and then I think it's been covered really well today, but just to say, I suppose, climate change from a mental health perspective exacerbates pre-existing health and social inequalities. So mothers are typically have a caregiving role. Climate change doubly impacts the burden of that caregiving role through increasing pressures on basic needs like drought, access to clean water, food security. And that is particularly acute from a climate justice perspective in developing countries. And then lastly, it's just to mention that, you know, heat is associated with increased mental health difficulties, but also increased suicidality and increased aggression. So there is reduced social safety for women from a climate justice perspective too, because of the increased dangers that come with it on a very physiological level. Just to kind of wave our next flag as we move to our next slide, to flag some groups that our health professions are involved in here. So it's the Climate and Health Alliance, Robert looking up. We are a member, PSI is a member, 31 organisations are a member along with the HSE. They are kind of pushing for strong climate action along kind of 6 major pillars in Ireland. People in the UK are really active on this. These are photographs of health professionals in the UK on strike in April 2023 because they regard failure on climate action as such an integral health issue. So we're moving towards our motivational, hopeful finishing point. Yeah,
go for it.
So I love this quote by Rebecca Solnit, who writes really beautifully on lots of feminist issues. But in relation to kind of social change and collective social action, she talks about hope being an axe to break down the door of possibility. So I want everyone to think of leaving here today with an axe. Could be a big axe, could be a small axe. Axes are heavy, but they're impactful, yeah. And your axe might look different to somebody else's axe, right? So I think the big thing to think about leaving here today is, how could I get involved? What would be meaningful and easy for me and satisfying for me? Because you won't stick with something that's not naturally rewarding. And the thing about it is, women are really good at this. And we've got photographs of some of our climate heroes, one of whom is in this room. I'm going to mortify her now. We've got Mary Robinson. Yes, and also like lots of great academics in Ireland are working on this, like Claire Kelly, Hannah Daly. Follow them if you don't already. Women have driven huge social change. Don't have time to get into that, but they have. In recent history here in Ireland, women have the emotional capacity to stay engaged with climate. There is a big issue with staying engaged with climate in that people tend to flip between doomism, can't do anything about it, we're all screwed anyway, or a disavow, sure, look, it's a big problem, but I won't do anything about it because, okay? And it's really hard to stay in the middle ground of, it's a big problem, I can accept that as a big problem, and yet I can stay engaged by doing X, Y, and Z. Women are good at that, yeah? You are very significant because you are health professionals. And why that is important is by talking about climate or becoming involved in some way, you are mainstreaming climate concerns. And the issue with that is climate tends to be othered. Those Greens are interested in that. Oh, it's kind of like it's a hobby for some people. They're kind of into the environment. And that's where we needed to shift away from that into something, and I think Vanessa spoke about this, it has to be kind of a lens that, you know, the fact that it's not in Vision for Change, I wasn't aware of that. And that to me is shocking, because climate needs to be the lens through which we see everything, because without a healthy climate, honestly, nothing else kind of matters, really. So thinking about that, thinking about how you can legitimize climate concerns using your professional voice, whatever that looks like for you. Is that in your workplace? Is that in your community? Is that in your family? And that even having a climate conversation is so important, because we know that from a psychological perspective, there is what's called a spiral of silence around climate, whereby we tend to underestimate other people's concern, and then we don't speak about it, or we dip it in, it feels a little uncomfortable, and then we dip back out just to make it okay, because it's both kind of a cultural Irish thing to need to make things okay, but also an inherent kind of emotional response to that. Yeah, so, and then
so in being hopeful and trying to be positive, as a group, we want to be here to serve. We want to bring a little, hopefully useful expertise that we might have in psychological dimensions, but importantly, we want to build synergies. We have had now over 2 years of being together as a group, and we found that we are the most energetic when we meet new people and we develop ideas based on the needs that have driven us to the meeting. So just saying it out there, please link up with us if you're interested, because we're really hoping to build bridges, wide bridges and connections that can help us to elevate the role of how important a healthy planet is for having healthy women and healthy people in general. So thank you so much, and sorry for being long.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Marica and Amy and Vanessa. So much information and learning and inspiration there. We really appreciate it. And just to mention as well, around the Climate and Health Alliance, the National Women's Council and St. Patrick's Mental Health Services are also members of the Climate and Health Alliance, and they're open to civil society organisations as well as health organisations, because we know, as has been flagged by Vanessa, older people, for example, we know are affected and more at risk in climate events, but also from things like air pollution, which just one example is one of the 14 modifiable risk factors for dementia, which means it can be changed. So why aren't we changing it? Anyway, so just to mention, the Climate Health Alliance and the PSI Special Interest Group are also linked in the information and resource lists that we will be circulating. So we're going to move on now to our panel discussion. Sorry, now I'm missing a page. You might just have to bear with me for 1 second. Sorry, I'm grabbing my phone. Oh, no worries. Just bear with me 1 moment. I'm just going to step over here to my bag and grab something. I think it's I might have a spare. Oh, that could be it. Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, thanks a million. Just a little interlude. Okay. So we're going to move on to our panel discussion now and have a bit more of a chat. We're going to open the floor to you guys as well for any burning questions you have. So Amy's kindly joining us at the panel, and I'm going to ask Liam MacGabhann and Elena Manciu to join us as well. So you can come on up. Elena is a Roma woman based in Dublin, and as the Climate Justice Peer Education Officer in Cairde, her work links Cairde and Friends of the Earth to deliver workshops and information on climate change, climate justice, and what that means to her community. She likes to draw and can be found exploring the botanical gardens as it connects her with nature. So I'm guessing, Elena, you're interested in this activity over here later on. And Liam MacGabhann has been working as a mental health practitioner, researcher, community activist and educator for 3 decades. Very early on, he recognised that traditional approaches and explanations for mental health challenges were of limited use to people with lived experience and their families, and were as likely to deter recovery than enhance it. Liam works at the North East Recovery College, which was established in 2016 in the community as part of a broader research programme, transforming dialogues in mental health communities. Their purpose was to utilise people's experience, lived or living experience, and emancipatory community education approaches to creating empowering community spaces and enhance personal and social recovery. So I'm going to scooch over here and join you. Now just do a mic check. Feel proper. Make sure. Yeah, everyone can hear us. So what I'm going to do is invite, first of all, I'll come to you, Elena, and ask you if you could tell us about your role and share any thoughts you have. Oh, sorry. No worries. So sorry. Apologies. Okay, all good. Sorry about that. What I'd ask you, Elena, is just to tell us a little bit more about your role and any thoughts you have on today's topic of climate crisis and women's mental health. Yes, of course you can, yeah.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Elena Manciu. I am a Roma woman raised in Spain, so my hair shared culture with both sides.
Is that better? Yeah. You're fine, take your time.
I moved to Ireland 5 years ago, and I started as a student at Cairde, and 2 years ago as a Roma climate justice per-education worker with Cairde and Friends of the Earth. Energy poverty is a big issue for many people, enveloping communities and families around the world in a vicious cycle of poverty. We realized that there is a very little information about our community and energy poverty. We decided this would be an important issue to research. I conducted an interview and questionnaires with 32 women and men from my community. They spoke about themselves and their families' household, representing information on 166 Roma people. The people I spoke with were mostly from Dublin and some were also from Cairde. The families I interviewed expressed feeling very anxious and stressed about their energy bills. One person shared with me the stress they experienced in trying to keep their home warm. Another big problem that I suffer in my house is expenses. In winter, I never allow myself to keep my house warm out of fear. Another issue that people spoke about was the poor insulation of their homes. They spoke about how the cold enters everywhere. Sometimes people were forced to put extreme of having to put tape and blankets on windows outdoors to stay warm. One person shared with me that their windows are very bad condition. The cold comes in. In winter, I have to put blankets so my children don't get cold. Poorly insulation houses are leading to a lot of waste energy. Most homes suffer from mold on the walls, and there are families with sick children, like one family whose son recently had hair surgery and spent a lot of anguish in winter keeping his home warm, knowing that will later pay the consequences. The two biggest challenges for mental health, I see it, for my community are poverty, racism, and discrimination. You are forced to feel like you are never enough, that you are isolated and you are helpless to be able to change the situation. Energy poverty just makes this feeling of stress and fear worse for Roma people. My goal with this work is to highlight the obstacles my community faces and to make sure that we are involved in the decisions that affect us and bring awareness about the intersection of racism and climate justice. I'm going to share some key facts from the research. More than 25% of people I interviewed were living in damp and structural unsound accommodation. 68% people say they were unable to keep their homes warm enough. More than 80% say they had to reduce their energy use to keep their bills low. Of the people who lived in private rental or social housing accommodation, 99% expressed being very worried or extremely worried about their energy bills. 84% of respondents say they do not feel confident in taking climate action. Thank you very much.
Thank you for putting so much work into that and for sharing your research findings. That sounds like a fantastic project and really important to hear about, I suppose, the real lived experience of people, and I suppose energy poverty isn't something we've touched on, or the significance of secure and safe and warm housing for our mental health. It's those circumstances we live in that support our mental health and that can be threatened or exacerbated by climate change and inequality. So thank you very much, and thank you for being here. Liam, I'll ask the same question of you in terms of telling us a bit more about your role. I know I did share a bit in the bio, and any thoughts you have on today's topic.
Thanks, Louise. I wasn't sure what I could say about the topic, other than living in kind of a calamitous kind of climate change. But as I was listening to people talking, so part of my role with the Recovery College, but also for many years has been a global activist towards a new paradigm in mental health against an old paradigm, which let's call a psychiatric paradigm, which genderizes consistently, and most people in the room will know that paradigm is actually bad for women, not good for women. For me, I see the parallel with the whole climate change. So within kind of the mental health sphere, we have a system that entrenches itself in an old paradigm. The more that activism tries to move and take action against damaging coercive practices, against damaging kind of capitalist kind of ways towards approaching mental health, and almost medicalizing, in this case, womanhood, in order to be able to sell products. It's very much a kind of a capitalist-driven, patriarchal-driven system, the system of psychiatry, as is within the whole climate change, the people who are denying climate change. So the people who deny climate change are the exact same people, the exact same kind of corporations, the exact same kind of ways of old paradigm thinking that does the same in mental health. We have old kind of psychiatric systems who don't want to let go of the power and don't want to let go of the expertise. We have capitalist systems who hold up the psychiatric system. And likewise in climate change, we have capitalist systems who hold up and kind of make sure we deny climate change. Equally, and I like the hopeful quote you talked about earlier on, which was collective action will bring about hope, and collective action will bring about, in this case, climate change. But also within the mental health sphere, it's collective action that's bringing about personal and social recovery in the community spaces. So that parallel for me is quite important. And I began to see why climate action and climate change is so relevant to women in particular, because it's genderizing in terms of the way that it's been tackled in society, as is the mental health. The last thing I'd like to say is, so the recovery colleges, we particularly, one of the things in the initial kind of sharing you had, what can recovery colleges do in relation to mental health and women? Well, it can do it in relation to community. And women playing a huge part, and we've already seen, caring roles, etc., play that part. But I would like to distinguish recovery colleges and recovery education, because many recovery colleges and many types of recovery education are about perpetuating the psychiatric paradigm. So I think it's really important to kind of pull down and actually see. So if I come under the governance of a mental health system that is perpetuating an old psychiatric paradigm, then that won't really be helpful for women, or in fact for anybody's social or personal recovery. If I'm working in community recovery education, which follows a community development model, as with our recovery college, which doesn't come under governance of a mental health system, then I'm involved in emancipatory education, which will be helpful for everybody, because it's about individuals and collective activism towards, in particular, personal and social recovery. So my role is actually perpetuating that in disadvantaged communities, in marginalised communities throughout Ireland and Europe as well.
Thanks so much for that. And I think it's really interesting and helpful. It's challenging sometimes to hold the lived experience and the reality of what inequalities and climate change related inequalities, how they impact mental health, day to day in life, as Elena really eloquently articulated, and then zooming out and looking at the systems where maybe there's huge power imbalances and the kind of common good isn't what's driving decision making or there's gender imbalances and who holds the power, whether that's in health systems or broader. So thank you for bringing that perspective. Amy, I'm going to come to you to ask, I know we have health professionals in the audience and community workers and people from different backgrounds, but in particular in relation to health workers who maybe want to become more climate aware in their work, and maybe try and bring it into their organisation, to the attention of people in the organisation, any suggestions or tips you would give for someone who might want to do that?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different ways you could approach this. So you could think about, similar to us, going through your kind of professional body. So like an OT or an SLT or whatever, you know, is there a green group as part of that? If not, could you start one? Then I think within your organization, often like it's pretty mixed across different CHOs within. I know it's called something else now. I'm actually on maternity leave, so my brain is not fully switched to the new mode. But there is green groups within those, and some of those are extremely well developed. So for example, North Dublin Mental Health Services are nearly totally climate neutral because they've just had a very strong group that have been in existence for a very long time. It's not the same. I'm in CHO7. It's not quite the same there. So you could think about, do I want to get involved more locally? Like, what's my own building like? You know, what's the energy used? You could think about, where do you want to pitch your energy within that? I think the first thing is, think about your capacity. What's my space for this right now? Yeah. Sometimes that might look like 0. Okay. So sometimes I think if it is 0, that's fine. But you might think about, could I donate to a climate organization like Friends of the Earth? So I'm transferring my work labor, whatever you can afford a month, into climate labor. It's a really good way to start if you don't have energy for that. And not just for that might be, if you want to think more locally, like thinking about contacting your TD, sending a few emails, or joining a group like Parents for Future or a local organization. Then you've got kind of your professional level voice, and then you've got your CHO voice. I think there's a couple of layers to it, and get informed. So there's some really good, there'll be links like reading our position paper. Rebecca Solness has written a resource you can find online. What can I do about the climate crisis? The answer, loads. So she's great because she talks about thinking about your scale. So what's my energy for this, and how much do I want to do with that? So that'd be my
really helpful suggestions
tips
there.
Yeah.
And you touched on something really important there around capacity. And I think that comes back to the policy piece that Vanessa was talking about, because really this shouldn't be an extra thing that health professionals take on, bearing in mind also that the health workforce is 70% female, not just in Ireland, but globally. And we know there can be, I think we talked about that kind of imbalances in who does other types of work outside professional work, etc. in the home. So what we really need to see as well is climate change merged and integrated into health policy, and health integrated into climate change, so that it's coming from top down. But in the meantime, heaps of things that we can do to get that sorted. Together we'll have it sorted by next week. I'm confident of everybody in this room. We'll figure it out.
And I think what you were saying earlier on too about like, where do we want to be? Like, let's think big. Really big as we can, And I think about what Louise was saying, a colleague of ours, Owen Gallivan, who was mentioned earlier on, who founded the group, he's involved in Curie Farm at the moment, which is really bringing those two perspectives together. So kind of a revolutionary, recovery orientated, step down environment that's focused on nature and the natural world for people with mental health difficulties. He's the director of that. They're building it. But that's an example of merging those two things, because I suppose we have to remember with climate, if we don't do enough, or we have to do as much as we can, every bit matters, we're going to have reduced access to the places that restore our mental health. It's a bit of a double whammy. And so they are very, very linked, but like, it's that kind of joined up thinking. Like another example that just drives me crazy is the school meals program. It was such a lost opportunity to have a climate lens through that. My colleague down there is nodding because we've talked about it today. But it was an example where there's been loads of conversation and dialogue in the media around it since. But why is that the case? Why is it that had to come after, as opposed to, if we truly want our leaders to lead on this, that should have been at the forefront of it? If you want to apply to be part of this scheme, what is the terms and conditions of which we want to be climate and nature that you need to fulfill? So is it locally produced? What's the packaging? What's the waste? How's the food waste managed? My own school definitely doesn't have a compost bin where my kids go. So that's, sorry, Bring it back, Amy. Just an example, though, of like the systemic layers of where we need climate to be at the front.
Yeah.
We talk about food waste out of one side of our mouth. Yeah, we need to reduce that. Insert big school program with loads of waste. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good example. Yeah, and that's not as health promoting and supporting as it could be as well. So then bringing it back to kind of, well, actually not just the individual level, but thinking about supporting mental health and well-being. And we know there's evidence for community work, collective action, but also nature, connecting with nature. And I know in your bio you have that lovely line about going to botanical gardens and connecting with nature. So I was going to ask all of you to invite anybody that's feeling a bit stressed today, and we do have our wonderful session later as well. But have you come across any examples in your community, volunteer work or professional work, or within your own lives that you'd recommend to support your mental health in terms of connecting with nature or sort of community-based activity? Elena, will I come to you first, or do you need a minute? Or... Yes. So I'm just wondering if you can, I guess, think of any examples where nature or connecting with community has helped mental health, either for you or within the people you work with, for the people you work with. I can come back to you if you need a minute to think about it.
I think it's very important because it's totally another life. When you are in the city, everything is industrial, and when you go in a natural place, I remember when I go with my colleagues, maybe in botanic garden is not the most natural place, it's artificial, but I see how she started dancing. I see she was children again, you know. So it's totally different when you are in a natural environment.
Yeah,
absolutely. You feel like all the negativity, all the bad thing. In this moment, you are there. You are in another place. Sorry.
Yeah. Absolutely, like it lowers your blood pressure, interrupts maybe trains.
It doesn't matter in this moment. You are there.
You are, present in the moment. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. How about you, Liam? Any examples of community work, sort of activities, or nature-based activities, perhaps, that have come up for you in the Recovery College or elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's happening is the anti-climate changers have also tried to make people fearful of nature. And people are afraid to kind of touch nature. So part of a lot of mental health response now is for people to embrace nature, the natural world. I heard Dave Moore on the radio saying he got stung yesterday by a nettle, hadn't been stung in 30 years. I mean, my argument is you should be stung at least once a week by a nettle in order to feel nature. But yeah, I mean, the Recovery College has Connecting with Nature. We've just finished that course, which is about going to nature spaces all over North Dublin. People come together and talking about their fears, talking about connecting with nature, and talking about how climate is changing. I work with the Sanctuary in Stanhope Street, and we've just developed a massive one-year program on connecting with nature. So it is a massive response now to nature, and like even Curie Farm is a whole ecological kind of process built into their mental health response when that kicks off. So it's very much on the mental health agenda, but in the alternative new paradigm. But the old paradigm is kicking against that as well. So yeah, so loads of examples. Yeah, moving meditation we're presently doing, where we're moving around the community instead of doing the kind of quiet meditation which freaks the hell out of people. We're doing moving meditation, which has the same impact, but it also connects more with the community and the nature.
Is it okay if we share information about or how people can learn more about the Connect with Nature program on our resources?
Yeah, well, the Recovery College, the website has it. And,
okay, perfect.
We'll soon be advertising through the Sanctuary, the actual one-year program.
Wonderful, thank you for that. And Amy, how about for you? Anything in particular stand out?
Yeah, I was thinking of one example just to show how stuff can happen. So I'm thinking about our colleague Claire Crowe, who joined the SIG later, and she first heard us speaking about the environmental issues at the conference. She's kind of an inspirational person, but she got inspired. And from that, she works in CHI, so the Children's Hospital. And since that, she trained as a forest school leader, and she's been intrinsically involved. She's the clinical lead on establishing it's on the roof, isn't it? On the roof of the new Children's Hospital. They've partnered with Barrettstown. So following Barrettstown's model is therapeutic recreation, so the importance of play for children. So implementing a forest forest, but access to nature and therapeutic recreation model for sick children, either in real life that they can access in the hospital while they're unwell, but also in a VR version, I'm understanding. And that's going to be the first of its kind in the world.
I think you can see all the trees on the building.
Oh, already?
I passed by today and was like, there is a lot of trees up high.
This is
Did
like
they
a
know
major.
that?
I know. Is that, have they thought that through? But yeah, so
that's wonderful.
This is an example of how, like, we're a small group. She saw us present, and you're kind of like, oh, plugging away here, you know. And then, like, that's led to a really tangible outcome that will be there forever. You know, forever. So, like, her children, her children's children, anyone who unfortunately has to attend the hospital will be able to avail of that facility. So, you know, collective action happens from the outside in, from lots of small movements like that. And that's something that's going to be visible to other people too, putting it on their agenda and in their mindset. So I suppose it's kind of like, I think climate often puts you in an uncomfortable place and you feel like a bit of an aegis at times, like, is this even worthwhile or making a difference? But the thing with social change is you don't get to know the difference you're making. You might never get to know. But that's not a reason not to try. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think we have time for a couple of questions, do we? Yeah. Yes.
It's not a question, but I just wanted to expand on that. I was actually at a talk last year where they spoke about that. And as well as that, they actually have, I think it's 12 or 14 indoor gardens woven throughout the whole hospital. But I was at the talk last year where they actually spoke about that and the whole initiative where it came from. So yeah, it was really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, wonderful. Any other questions, comments, thoughts, ideas you have for little forests and stuff? Fine.
Yeah, hi, just to introduce myself, I'm Sive O'Neill and I work with Vanessa on the Feminist Communities for Climate Justice project. And in the last phase of the project, we're going to be launching a campaign. So up until this point, Vanessa was describing how we done the baseline report and we set up the national network and various working groups. But as we kind of move towards the end of the project, we want to do more advocacy, public engagement and communications around a particular theme. And the theme that we're likely, now it hasn't been completely finalised, to choose is around healthy communities. Now, that's a cluster of different things. But the reason I'm mentioning it to you guys is that we'll be looking for examples and case studies. So if you have an idea that you think is scalable, and lots of the things that you guys have mentioned are, I've written them down and they are going to make their way in, but I need lots more examples of that because I think it's easy to focus on what's missing, but we need to be able to describe the kind of interventions that are needed if we're going to make any of these changes happen. And just because they happen successfully in one place doesn't mean that other people have heard about it. So we need to showcase some of the really good examples and how to do things, how not to do things, whether it's on green spaces or any other type of health intervention. So any ideas would be more than welcome. And you can contact us through whatever
we can share a link.
You've got on your table there, you know, there's a QR code or maybe Vanessa's email is somewhere. So that would be great. Thank
we
you.
can make sure to share a link as well to it in the information we send out.
Yes, yes, exactly.
That would be helpful. So anybody who's heard any kind of studies mentioned, any projects, any groups mentioned that you're interested in or initiatives like this, we will include it in an email afterwards and then you can send it on to other people. You know, everybody will know about them. So we will make sure to get that. I think we have time for another question or two. If anybody has any questions or thoughts or comments.
Hi, I just had a question. As a social worker, I work with Louise and Pat's, but I used to work in child protection in quite a marginalised community, and a huge focus at that time for me in my work was that energy poverty that you spoke of, Elena. I worked with a lot of lone parent families with huge financial pressures, and unfortunately in that line of work, a lot of the harm or the safety has to be categorised. And I'm just wondering if you as kind of practitioners and also educators and people with lived experience have any tips or suggestions as to how to incorporate that into practice when you're out in the community and you're working with parents or families who are facing that kind of energy poverty, how we can include that into our interventions or our assessments that will actually be kind of considered by, you know, larger agencies or, you know, transferable into other disciplines considerations.
So
It's
what,
kind of vague, but does that?
like what would you like if you're engaging with health service or health professional? What would you like them to be doing to help you with things like energy poverty? And
Yeah, absolutely. And I know in certain areas there's specific things around like grants and, but you know, as we said, a lot of the time you have to have the initial disposable income. But just more in terms of, you know, as social workers, we have a huge onus to take students, and we kind of continue that cycle of learning, and we work really closely with people in community education or recovery education. So what would be a good kind of a consideration for kind of practice going forward in terms of that energy poverty awareness and working with specific populations?
Any thoughts, Liam or Elena, things that you'd like to see health workers doing, asking about, helping with health services?
Workers who can help the people.
Yeah, and like so that they're not missing things like energy poverty, and what can they do to sort of make sure they're responding in a helpful way to people they're working with around energy poverty? Is there anything?
It's difficult, but maybe suggestions with the energy, better choices. These electric vampires try to put attention in the little details.
Little details,
Yeah, but for me, the big issue is the poor insulation in the home. So,
or inflation.
yeah, it doesn't matter what you do.
Yeah.
Wasting.
Yeah. So it's doubly harmful because it's affecting obviously your well-being day to day, physical health, but also mental health.
Yeah, because never is enough.
Yeah. So people helping with the little details. And do you think from your experience, or maybe from the people in your research study, are health workers sort of informed about, say, energy poverty as an idea? Do they?
No, it's not the idea for the people.
No, they haven't. It's not something on
No,
their.
it's another bill to pay.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not a maybe something that people are aware of. Yeah. Okay. So something that needs more attention in health services. Liam, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a practitioner myself, and I understand that often we're kind of directed towards particular kind of assessment, kind of protocols, and that kind of, and there's particular kind of responses we have to make, blah blah, as you suggested. So for me, the other thing we have as practitioners is we have a relative autonomy in how we engage in conversations with people. So regardless of assessments, if our approach is more curiosity based, and if we are learning as people to be, say, for example, more climate orientated, more kind of trauma conscious, more dialogical conscious, just that curiosity based approach allows that. So when somebody, so we've got a term called kind of, you know, energy kind of poverty. For somebody it's else, the language will be different. It's I can't afford to turn on the electricity, you know, and that allows you to kind of bring that into your assessment, into your kind of, you know, your psychosocial stressors or whatever, but in the language of the interaction. No, but really.
No, 100%.
Yeah.
I'm nodding fervently.
Sometimes as practitioners, we underestimate our own autonomy, even within the mandated kind of assessment. So kind of just push them a little bit further away when you can't see them, and say, oh, there's a question there, and be more curious about the question.
Yeah, that's an excellent suggestion. I'm conscious of time, and I know we have a wonderful session over here. Imagine if I said, sorry, we don't have time for this, and you never found out what was in that corner. Imagine how devastated we'd all be. What I'm suggesting we do is we're going to have a 10 minutes break, and when we come back, I'll introduce Dr. Sinead O'Connor, and we'll introduce the Climate Cafe then. So if you want to stretch your legs, step outside for some fresh air, look at the beautiful nature around us outside, get some water, have a chat, and we'll reconvene at 12 o'clock, if that's all right. Thank you. And thank you to our panelists. I'm so sorry. Thank you so much, Elena and Amy. Thank you so much for joining us and for all your thoughts. And I can't believe I said thank you guys. I'm so sorry.
Are you going to? Yeah, Brad.